Okay. Now we're recording. Sorry about that. Okay, so there wasn't a whole lot in the agenda for today. But we wanted to discuss primarily some announcements. KubeCon intro and deep dives are coming up. They're listed on the website. I believe rooms haven't been selected yet, but dates and times have. So if you're going to San Diego, come check out and participate. If there's any topics that you guys particularly want to talk about, I think for the deep dive, we'll have plenty of time for open discussions and to bring up new topics. But if there's anything in particular, just let us know. So Code Freeze is coming up November 14th. Does anybody need anything? I see the max and available PR review from my ink, so that I'll go take a look at. I assume that means that's the max and available for staple set PR. And the implementation coming in by Monday. So that should probably make the cut. That shouldn't be a problem. If there's anything else, yeah, let us know. And then for discussion topics, I believe Janet was the one, who had the recommendation labels for apps. And she wanted to discuss this, so I'll hand it over to her.
Hey, so I believe it's a while ago that we discussed the recommended labels for all the apps, and one of the labels is the managed by label that you can use it to record which app you use, which tool you use to manage your app. So my question is, what if I have a series of toolchain that's used to deploy this app? For example, if I have a CI/CD pipeline, then there's a bunch of tools that's being used for this app. And then how do I record such information in my application manifest? I mean, my application resources running in the cluster. So
yeah, Janet, I think I understand where you're getting at. So the little context on this was formed a little bit out of Helm with the managed by. Helm had a similar annotation, and the idea behind it was if you have something that's not just installing it, but kind of managing it, right? So you might have Helm managing some applications and then other tools managing other applications. They've kind of got the ownership on the upgrade and listing in other processes, right? And even if you're going to go between tools, you may want to switch this over time. And it was this idea that kind of one tool has the ownership lock on it. Now, if you're dealing something like, so it wasn't meant to record your entire CI pipeline, or if you're using GitOps, which is a pull model rather than the push, your entire pipeline of tools. The whole idea was to say, this is the thing that kind of owns it, whether you're using it in CI, whether you're using it locally, whether you're using it someplace else. And it wasn't meant to document your whole tool chain. If we wanted to document that tool chain somewhere, I would suggest maybe a different thing for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. But right now, Kubernetes doesn't support an array of maps.
An array of tools involved in your process, right?
Yeah.
Here's maybe a question. What's the use case for Kubernetes storing that?
It's mainly for for people to understand how many, for example, I can use a label query to find how many workloads are managed by this tool. And yeah, many things like that. Or you can show this in a dashboard.
So, and maybe this gets into it. If I'm using a CI toolchain, right? Let's just grab something like Circle. It's popular. If I've got it deploying, would I say it's managed by Circle, or Circle is just one of the tools? Because might you in a one-off use the same tools you're using inside of Circle to go triage and correct a problem? And so is it, I'm trying to dig deeper. How much of this array of tools really says what's managing it, or what's just being used in the process through the mainline?
So I'm thinking the managed by label is not the right place to store this information, and interested to hear how people are storing this information, or some information like this, like you have a serious things that you want to record in your resource, then how do you do about it? So I put an idea in the agenda doc. Maybe it can be a toolchain.1, toolchain.tool label, but it's a little bit hacky because it's not easy to query against. You need to know how many toolchains you have in your labels.
I actually use annotations for this mostly. Like for the in-house automation that I use to like orchestrate various things in the cluster, primarily like we use annotations as opposed to labels. It's not selectable, right? Like it's not usually something that humans would interact with, but it's kind of just to like understand the provenance of something and everything. So I mean, maybe that's slightly orthogonal to what you're talking about. Like maybe there's a requirement to be able to like select things that this controller has actually like modified, or that this controller is in some way orchestrating.
So this is actually one of the reasons I asked what the use case was for. You know, what's the reason behind it? I think, Ken, I heard you talk about recording provenance. And so if something comes in and modifies it, you can record that because you're getting the provenance of basically who's touched everything. And on Janet's side, I think I heard Janet, you say you were talking about maybe visualizing it and querying on it. You know, we'll go back to the Circle CI. Maybe I say, give me everything that's been run through Circle CI. And you compare everything that's run through Circle CI versus everything that's run through Travis, right? If you're looking for different CI tools. But you need that to be queryable. So I'm kind of hearing maybe two different use cases. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I hear somebody in the background saying something?
I hear somebody in the background, but I can't tell whose mic is active.
I think it's, is it Anil? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Yeah, you're the mic that is active that I don't know. Okay, maybe it wasn't involved in this. All right.
Hey, this is Thomas. So for Janet's use case, can you just query the API server request metrics, which shows the client, so you know who is acting on which objects?
I'm not sure that's going to give you, if you have a CI tool that's calling a client though, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can set client for OC.
Plus, I'm wondering if the client is not enough here. It sounds like what Janet was interested in was a series of tools that led to the resulting steps. So I'm wondering if this is, if Janet, you were thinking about tools like Customize and other tools that may generate resources that get then get deployed by something else. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, Customize could be one of those tools.
Mm-hmm.
So the tool doesn't necessarily directly talk to API server.
Yeah.
I think we don't need to have an answer now, but just want to hear how everyone is using it or have some other ideas. So I think for now we can just use what I proposed, the labels with numbered with index at the end, and then see how we can improve from there. And that's all for me.
Yeah, I mean, another option is to have a single label with comma separated values or some other delimiter, but then again, it's not really that searchable.
Yeah. Is there a pattern that anybody else is using for storing an array of information?
Arrays are kind of tough in Kubernetes.
Yeah. That's why I was asking if anybody else had come up with some pattern, because I'm thinking I'm not sure I'd handle it, but maybe somebody else has already tried to solve this.
I mean, like, especially if you're going to do it in a label, that's really tough. Like, I don't know how you do it and make it selectable and reasonable, unless you like, yeah, I can think of some ugly hacky things, but nothing that I would be proud of.
No. Yeah. That's kind of where I'm at, and which is why I asked the question. Well, Janet, thank you for coming up with such a simple problem for us today.
Thank you.
I mean, from the provenance aspect, I'm also wondering, granted, this is just getting trickier because, when it comes to provenance, just touching something and saying it's there doesn't give you a whole lot of provenance. It actually makes me wonder if there's a way to incorporate something like in toto into the stack. That's just me thinking out loud. It doesn't really help with the, well, it could be incorporated into the UI, but that's for provenance stuff. I'm not sure how you do it here, but are folks familiar with in toto? If you're not, did it become it's a sandbox project in the CNCF created by the same folks who came up with, what's the tough that's used by Notary. And I'll drop it into chat here. And it's actually designed to secure software supply chains and allow it to sign and pass things around and do all of that stuff. And so it's designed specifically for provenance of software supply chains. So the provenance aspect is the reason that made me think of it. All right, Ken, well, you're chairing, so back to you.
Okay. So I think that was all we had on the agenda. Does anyone else have anything they want to bring up? Okay, I guess we can end early. So hey, are we gonna do?
Wait,
Go
can
ahead.
sorry, I have one. This is Steve Pusti. I have one quick question. I'm
Sure.
a very infrequent visitor to SIG Apps.
Okay.
Is this where we would talk about like developer tooling, like so that developers don't have to write YAML and all that kind of stuff to work with Kubernetes, or is there another SIG for that?
I can jump. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, so there was a working group for developer tooling, but I haven't seen them meet in quite some time. SIG Apps is a good place to do that. I think we traditionally have talked a lot about developer tooling and things surrounding the ecosystem that use the Workloads API. From a maintainer perspective, we're kind of concerned primarily with the Workload API, though.
Yeah, so in the past, we spent quite a bit of time talking about developer tooling. There was I'm forgetting the name of the work group. It's spun out, but it's closed now. And so the developer tooling technically falls back here. Since then, the CNCF has also created their own app delivery SIG. The CNCF, which is the parent organization to Kubernetes, has created special interest groups to support the TOC, Technical Oversight Committee, and they have a SIG app delivery, and that is another venue. But we have talked a lot about Kubernetes-specific developer tooling over time to simplify that whole process. And I personally would be very interested in hearing more about that if folks had things they wanted to talk about or share in that space.
I have opinions.
I'd love to hear opinions too.
But those are cheap. I guess the reason I was kind of asking, it's not really about app delivery, right? It's more about app construction. So to try to get Kubernetes adoption in the sense of this is actually a good place to do your development work. How do you actually construct an app? How do you wire things together easily? How do you do? I would imagine I was thinking that would fall under SIG Apps. It's not how I deliver an entire app once I've built it. It's more of how do I build an app actually on the platform is what I was.
Yeah, and I think it falls into both the scope here and over there.
Okay.
Some of the things we may look at incubating a project here, or we may just encourage and share and demo projects. We do have demo slots. We haven't had many demos lately. But if you go to the past of SIG Apps, you'll see many demos of different tools, including some CNCF projects when they're very early on, like Telepresence, which is a debugging tool that you can use while you're building a service, along with a bunch of other microservices, things like that.
Okay.
And so we're very happy to talk about those. And if you've got opinions, I'd be very curious to hear
them. Maybe. So I'll give you I don't know if you want to do it. Do you want it now?
Sure, you're here. We've got a few minutes, and you've got all the chairs here. So please let us hear it.
So Mason, so just by way of background, I was one of the original developer advocates on OpenShift, right? So I no longer work on OpenShift. I no longer even work at Red Hat. I now work at Crunchy Data, the Postgres people. We have an operator. We used to have a stateful set, but then it's been migrated to an operator. My job is developer relations at Crunchy Data. So and to get people excited about using Postgres, but I am excited about getting people using the operator most particularly. My opinion is the experience is miserable for the most part. Even with like OpenShift is slightly better, but it's still miserable in terms of how a developer, like when I was even just working with some developers here who had they were used to PKS, or they were just used to regular Kubernetes, and they're like, okay, I guess I'm going to write some YAML now. Right. And so I think most developers never want to write YAML. And it's kind of a broken experience at the point at which we're making developers write YAML. Even a Helm chart most developers don't want to write the Helm chart, I guess. So
I'll jump in on Helm because I think there's a little confusion on this.
Okay.
Helm charts they're packages. And so just think of it like apt packages. almost nobody ever creates an apt package. You take somebody who understands something like Debian or Ubuntu and
Right.
somebody who understands your package like Postgres, they create an apt package, and
Right.
then the 99.9% of other people use apt-get install Postgres, and they don't ever have to know that because somebody who understands the complexities brings them together so that almost nobody else has to. And that's the
Agreed.
idea of a Helm package. And so in that case, I think Helm's successful, but almost no developer should ever have to create their own Helm package. It's a small subset. So it doesn't really solve the developer problem.
Exactly. So, but I think for most people, what ends up happening is they're saying, oh, how do I get my Python app onto Kubernetes? Oh, well, either you're building a container and writing YAML or build a Helm chart to install your container onto Kubernetes. But there is no good solution. Like there's S2I, which never went anywhere, right? And it still had problems, and Red Hat doesn't. Now I can talk freely since I'm no longer at Red Hat. I don't think Red Hat really cares that much about S2 source to image, the S2I. They still have it there, but development on making it better hasn't really happened. And so there is no good solution for, I've got code, I want stuff in Kubernetes.
Now, there was Draft that the Microsoft folks have been working on, but that's basically a dead project unless somebody else wants to go take it on. And that was kind of like take your PaaS solution, but move it locally. So they would detect what you're writing in, try to create the right Docker file for you. They used Helm charts, but they just tried to create configuration in the background and gave you that closed loop save thing. And they called it Draft Pack, but it's basically built on the idea of a build pack. And how do you have that locally so you get those loops, even with applications that are not so much 12 factor, right? Which is where you get into the PaaS. But you're right. This last year, I looked at a whole lot of data on this, and I found that there aren't good tools for this, quite frankly. In fact, if you want to take something like WordPress, right? WordPress, the prototypical example, and you back it with MySQL or MariaDB, and you want to get your basic, or Postgres, yes. And you want to get your basic setup going, right? Not like no pod security policy, no horizontal pod auto scaling, any of those things, right? You just take your basic thing, your low barrier to entry. You're talking 13 different manifests, 13. And you're probably talking, 1,000 lines of YAML?
Yeah.
And that's just to launch your basic. That is a terrible user experience. So I agree with you. So I'm very curious. Do you have any ideas? Okay, we've defined it terrible. Do you have any ideas on how to improve on that and maybe take it in an easier direction so we don't just vent and rant?
Yeah, no, I get it. And that's part of what I was here. I was hoping there would be people here who would have better ideas, right? I'd have to have an engineering team and people who were like, I mean, I can think of things, but I'm afraid have you ever seen that Simpsons episode where Homer's put in charge of designing the car?
Yes.
So I'm a little afraid of designing the Homer Simpson car when I say the things that I want. I mean, there was some iteration I did just before I left Red Hat on stuff that I thought was better, in the sense of we need something I know there's the Kube API, but I almost think there needs to be an API and concepts above Kube for developers. So I think I was the draft of the spec for OKD, not OKD. What do they call it? ODO? I don't know. It's a new command line tool, which was supposed to be higher level concepts for developers. Because I don't think most developers who want to deliver, it's like saying if I want to develop a desktop app, okay, well, you have to learn Linux kernel internals to develop a desktop app, right? Like that's not the level we want most developers working at. So I think what we kind of need at some level is the Kubernetes community to say, okay, yeah, this is the API for sysadmins and for, Kube operators and DevOps and those people. And then there's the API that wraps those concepts into higher level concepts where developers do their day in and day out work.
So on that note, I have not looked at this.
Okay.
I've not looked at it. Microsoft a couple of weeks ago released something called the Open Application Model. They worked with.
Yes.
And I haven't looked at it, so I don't know. And it's still YAML.
I know.
But as far as I can tell, right? So if you're going to go with a PaaS and you're going to grab something like Heroku or Cloud Foundry, you still have to configure it. And for them, it's JSON. You still have a small file that passes certain things in, such as it's a 12-factor app. Here's your domain. Here's how much memory we need, right? There's minimal characteristics like that. But based on that, you can generate a lot more based on a lot of assumptions. Use build packs, things like that. You still have to collect a small amount. And I worked on something at Samsung this last year that was similar to that, just as a proof of concept. It's not released yet. And I found that for I don't know what percentage of cases, between 50 and like 80% of cases, you can actually do that for Kubernetes. You're not going to get all the crazy features, but almost nobody does. And then you can generate stuff. In fact, from your generation of code, you can say, you know what, in this cluster, I'm using Ingress. In this cluster, I'm using Istio. In this cluster, I'm using Linkerd. So in my generation, generate the right stuff for each one of those cases. You can do crazy things like that, right?
Right.
Fun things. You extrapolate that away.
And I think that's and so, you know, you're talking about the 50 to 80%. I think that's the right mindset that we should have, which is, look, to onboard, we're going to make it easy for you. To get through most of your typical use cases, we're going to make it easy for you, because at that point, then I'm invested in the platform. And then if I need something crazy, then I'm willing to invest the mental and time and all that other energy to learn I can use my typical thing to generate some stubs, but then I'm going to spend the next 4 days writing YAML trying to get this really complicated thing going. But if you start with that, you have to write a whole bunch of complicated YAML to begin with. Most developers are like, I'm out. No, thank you. So I was hoping that there'd be something happening here. You know, you're right. I forgot about the Microsoft effort, and that might actually be something interesting. I think that's coming out of the DS people. I think the DS team is the one that.
It is the folks over there, and they worked with Alibaba on this.
Okay.
And so they did. I would just take a look at it. I'm hoping to before KubeCon, because we won't have a meeting in 2 weeks on Monday, which is something we should probably talk about in this meeting.
Okay.
We won't be meeting again until December 2nd. And so it might be worth trying to get a demo from them in here to talk more about it. I haven't had a chance to evaluate it, but you're absolutely right. There's a gap there, and we probably need to get more conversations going on that gap so people can start to talk about it. Because I'll be honest, we talked to people on this, and I've heard from lots of organizations that this cognitive learning that you have to do is a problem.
Yeah.
It's like a real world problem that we're running into. And there are organizations out there that are saying no to Kubernetes because the onboarding is too difficult.
Yeah. Especially for
too costly.
Yeah. Especially for the developers too, right? Like sysadmins, they expect to get into this stuff. I mean, it's still expensive and hard for them, but developers are like, I'm already learning like the latest and greatest JavaScript. I don't have time to learn how to write YAML to just declare all these things these low-level concepts that I don't care about anymore, right? Like I just want a URL. I don't want to talk about ingresses. Just give me a URL that works.
Yeah. Well, it gets into the separation of concern. I'm concerned with my business logic.
Right.
I don't want to be too concerned with all the intricacies underneath it, because I'm concerned with my layer. You're concerned with your layer. Let's have clean interfaces between the layers that allow us to engage on that. And so I think you're absolutely right. And I'd love to have more talk on that. So thank you for bringing it up.
I would say one thing, like many organizations end up using Kubernetes, whether hosted or not, as a base layer infrastructure orchestrator, and then implement their own paths on top of it. Generally something more sophisticated than OpenShift, and that meets the direct needs of their organization. Airbnb is an example. There are many examples out there. Pinterest, like they'll develop models and orchestrators that are geared to their specific workloads using CRDs. So that's one approach. If you're looking for something uniform that solves the problem in the general case, I haven't seen anything that is adequate to do that. If you're looking to offer that or go build that under the domain of SIG Apps, I mean, like it's a lot of work.
I completely agree, but I also think that SIG Apps could at least push the model of what it's trying to accomplish. Maybe not actually build it, but at least say there is a need for this, and then see if you can coalesce. I mean, the problem with what you're talking about, the people who build their own stuff are the unicorns who build their own stuff. And so, you can get Airbnb to adopt Kubernetes, and you can get these companies that have huge technical staffs with deep expertise, but to be at the same level, that's like saying the people who used to adopt Linux, right? It used to be unicorns or people who had really big staff, and then things started going on top of it to make it easier for people to run and package stuff and to put together the things they wanted. And that's when you start getting more mass adoption. So
I mean, sure, but like I would say this too, like people who run open source Linux without a support contract from, say, Red Hat or Canonical, and who don't know how to maintain their own kernel hygiene, are probably not doing themselves any favors in the long run when a security vulnerability pops up, right? So like,
Yeah.
But that's a totally different discussion. At that point, you've at least got them to say, oh, I love Linux and I want to run Linux, which is the problem that I think we're going to end up facing in this group. If you can't make it so that developers like, I love Kubernetes, it makes my job better, as opposed to, I hate Kubernetes because just to get my app launched, I have to write 31 YAML files. That's what I'm saying.
And I think, Steve, you made a good point earlier, is we're like asking developers to go right against the Linux kernel itself, right?
Right.
We don't do that. App developers never even think about that stuff, right? They're using something like Node.js, and then Node.js as an environment just runs on there. So they may do a lot of the development on Windows or Mac, and then when the application is run in production, or even in the QA environments or dev environments or whatever, it's running in Linux. They see no difference, and they never had to learn the Linux kernel APIs in order to do this, because their tools just automatically work and translate into that environment.
Right. So I like to think of Kubernetes as the new OS, right? The distributed system operating system. And I think we just need to build the tooling around making it easier for developers. When I say we, I don't mean this group specifically. I mean we, the community. We need to start building the tooling so that it can actually act that way for higher level apps and application developers. That was my whole point. And I was wondering if this was the group to do it, but it sounds kind of mixed.
I would say this, right? Like, if you want to use the analogy that like app developers use Node.js or JVM or Beam, or like if you're saying that like not everyone is a C developer that understands low level system calls, sure. But like there's not just one way to do it, right? It's not like all app developers run Node.js. On top of the powerful primitives that are provided by an operating system, there are communities that built Java. They built the JVM, and the people who build the JVM do write it in C and do understand low-level kernel primitives across multiple operating systems. The same is true of the CLR runtime, which powers .NET. The same is true of V8, which powers Node.js. So, yep. I mean, there's definitely a need for people to build these platforms that provide value and in terms of developer velocity and ease of use on top of an operating system. The question is, should there be one to rule them all, or should there be many? And, you know, for particular use cases like Node.js is not my favorite. JavaScript is not my favorite thing for a backend service, but it's popular and it has its use case. Java can be verbose, but again, like it still powers much of the enterprise because of its kind of prolific presence. So like, maybe the answer might be there are many different models that you could build on top of Kubernetes, and you should use the one that best suits your organization.
But there is none right now. But my point is, nothing's being built right now. So it's all, you're either a kernel developer, or you're like a low-level C programmer, or you're going to learn to be a C programmer, whether that fits you or not, because of the state of our ecosystem.
I mean,
so Ken, maybe let me put it this way, Ken, if you don't mind, maybe put it this way. It's not about Kubernetes owning and building one version here, right? This is different than us owning and building one version. It's we are in a position of leadership where we can encourage the development of these. We can showcase them, and we can give certain kinds of rewards in the way that developers get rewarded by being called, things like that, in order to continue to encourage the development of these. Because right now we've identified we need them, but we don't have them. So how can we encourage the development of these outside of the Kubernetes project in order to help them facilitate the growth of Kubernetes usage and happiness and joy? If that makes sense.
Sure, but I would say that there are some out there. You might not like them, but you know, there's Plumi. Again, like a lot of the companies that have built these things have open sourced them. Well, I mean, we could go look at them, and I mean, people who are interested can review them and recommend them, I suppose. But
I would love to have reference to them, because usually when I see them, they are a DevOps tool, not a developer tool, and the line difference isn't called out. It's DevOps people saying, look at this tool, developers should use it. And then a developer comes along and goes, this isn't for me, this is for DevOps people. There's a difference, and it's not noted.
Well, then I think the other thing is to go and talk about the difference between what Kubernetes enables for organizations and what it does for developers. Because the experience of somebody who's using Kubernetes as a development environment on top of Minikube is very different from what your actual requirements are once you want to deploy it at scale across an organization with hundreds to thousands of engineers who are continuously deploying into production. Like, it's not the same concerns. At least from looking at both sides of it from my company, it's definitely not the same concerns. So, and it's even at Google scale, it's not the same concerns. So,
yeah. But I would say that Google is a unicorn case, and the company that you're at, they went and they hired people who specifically were experts in Kubernetes in order to pull this off. And quite frankly, almost there aren't enough bodies out there in order for every company that needs this to go hire that expertise in order to make it happen. It needs to be automated. It needs to be made a low barrier to entry. And so that's just one of the problems that is ending up showing up.
I guess, but I mean, like, if you really, well, I don't know.
And what I'm saying here is we SIG apps, we can encourage the growth and the development of more of these tools. And that is a useful endeavor for us to spend some of our time on.
I agree with that. We can try.
I'll
That's
add
all we
my
can
2
do.
cents. Hey, this is Maji. I'll add my 2 cents because I think both within SIG apps and SIG CLI, I was looking at the topic of having some higher level API, just like Steve was describing. And honestly, each and every single approach that I was taking led me to the conclusion that, oh yeah, this will address the basic 10, 20% of use cases. But as soon as I want to tweak it with, I don't know, my specific deployment, my specific use case and whatnot, I end up going down into the yums. I do agree that having an entry-level tooling is very desirable. That's one of the reasons why SIG CLI wanted to have some kind of dynamic commands where we could at least provide users with a consistent and ubiquitous kubectl create command for literally every single possible resource, where the flags would be the additional tweaks against any kind of resource. Currently, that effort hasn't moved a whole lot due to us splitting the kubectl out of the main repo. But I do hope that after we're done with this effort, we could return to that one, at least to ensure that the entry level is much better for users. On top of that, I think it would be useful to sync with SIG usability. I guess, Steve, that's for you. Or you can also show up for the SIG CLI and speak about it, your thoughts a little bit more. We're meeting this Wednesday as well, around the same time.
Are there Slack channels on those? Is that where I would join those?
Yeah.
Yes, you can join. They both have Slack channels. Every SIG has its own Slack channel.
Okay, so what was
Exactly.
it? SIG CLI and SIG usability?
Usability, yeah.
Thank you. Hey, nice to talk to you again, Mrs.
So one thing that I would throw at this is I think that a lot of the app developers out there, the developers, many of them don't even want to use a CLI. And so what we need is things that can be used to power tools built on top of CLIs. A significant amount of people want to use a GUI, quite frankly. And I know around Kubernetes, we are so used to CLIs. I live in my terminal, right? In fact, I've got tabs and windows. I've probably got as many as I have browsers open, interacting and doing different things. And that's not the typical use case when you get into lots of developers, especially in the enterprise. And so the ability to have things at a higher level abstraction where they don't even have to open up a terminal is important. And I know we don't think that a lot, especially in the ops, DevOps space, but that's where a lot of them are at. And that's why I say it's different.
Yeah, and I do think that this is what I do like that Kube has really done around their CLI, is it's basically just calling into a REST interface, right? So then the higher, you could think of the CLI as at least prototyping some of the things that you can then put a GUI on using the same REST API, right? So that's what I really liked also. I don't know if it's in kubectl or kubectl or however people want to pronounce it, but in OC you could pass a debug flag and it would show you all the REST calls that were happening under the scenes when you were using the CLI. I'm sure there's something in kubectl or something like that. Is that how?
Yeah, there's if you go with -v, depending on the level, you get only requests, or you get requests and response, and these are levels 7, 8, 9, if I remember correctly.
Right. I think the CLI is a good place to start, but it's not the end condition. But then I think tooling vendors could take that over, right? I could see IntelliJ has already done stuff around Kubernetes. If there's enough developer adoption of I develop in Kubernetes, then the tooling vendors will be like, well, that's where the developers are. That's what we need to build tooling around to make it easier. I don't think we don't have to necessarily take on what the GUI looks like. I just think we need to make it so there's concepts that are easier.
That's one of the reasons that we spent a lot of effort into moving a lot of the functionality server side, so that, and although I will be focusing on CLI as part of the role that I have leading the SIG, we do have, and we are putting a lot of effort to make the API interoperable, so that whatever is possible within the kubectl can be done as easily from standalone application, from web app. There is a project that is part of the SIG CLI done by IBM folks, which is called KUI, that's the KUI, and that provides a Electron-based UI around kubectl commands. I'll link to the project itself. So yeah, we do try to put a lot of effort into ensuring that this is. And truth to be told, since I spend majority of my time, like 99% of time within the CLI, at least from my perspective, whenever I look at OpenShift Web Console, I'm always mesmerized how far they went between releases, because this is like literally how frequently I look at the web UI, being the CLI person. So if you haven't got a chance to maybe give it a try, the way it is currently versus what you know from the past, Steve.
No, I've seen it. I mean, so even I don't know if we want to have that discussion, but even here at Crunchy, I refuse to just use straight Kubernetes just because it's so painful for me as an app developer. I'm like, okay, we're just going to use Red Hat's distribution of Kubernetes because there's no way I'm writing YAML all the time. And even if you want to use it on straight Kubernetes, I'm still going to use OC new app to generate, or the web UI to generate that YAML at least, that I can then take and modify to use in a straight Kubernetes cluster. But there's no way I'm going down that route on my own. So
that's literally what I would like to see happening within the kubectl, having this, this is the app, generate me at least the initial bunch of YUMs for me to start with. And then sooner or later, I'll start twiddling with the YUMs. And I think that's a good first step that we're missing in kubectl.
You have to know a lot about it though, right? So this is also getting into, I mean, what you're talking about is getting a little bit into some of the functionality that was in draft and some of the other tools that are out there that are getting into this space, that are attempting to do it, because you've got to assume a lot about when you're going to give me an application like the KUI, KUI tool that expects, I'm going to know pods, and I'm going to care about pods, and I'm going to expect pods, and I'm even going to look at that level, which is not the level of granularity an app developer is going to care about. They, quite frankly, a lot of them, for many apps, are going to want the Heroku level. And I'm assuming that Heroku is doing a lot with Kubernetes because, hey, at the Cloud Native Con, they're going to be talking. They're giving one of the keynotes I saw. And they've been hiring for Kubernetes people, and their systems in the past were basically a container manager on top of, but they were using LXC containers before, or whatever they're using now. Hopefully they talk about it, but it's that higher level abstraction that people want. And we're getting back down into the details, right? We're getting down into what pods, and I want to see the details of the pods, which is what like KUI does. And we want the creation of all these files. How do we get it so that some of this is out of sight, out of mind? Sorry, Steve,
So
you're
here,
muted.
yeah, sorry. So here's the, I'm going to post it in the chat also. This is what I had started specking out and had started the work on at OpenShift. It was ODO. And this, we got rid of the concept of pods in talking about it for developers. Like pods were underneath, but we had things called components. Like there's an application, what do we call them? A project, an application, and components. So a project can have multiple applications inside of a project, and then you have components within an application, not a pod. And you don't have an ingress, you have, just give me a URL. Like that was what it was supposed to be. So that talking the concepts of developers, but underneath the hoods, it does what the right thing, right? So a single component, right? So a single component application. You don't, there's no talk of pods, if people care. That's the other thing that we had worked on. And
Yeah, it's like an app developer doesn't end up going and inspecting the individual processes that are running and pulling up the kernel's metadata on the processes, right? You don't end up doing that if you're developing your app unless you really have a need, which is very, very rare.
Right. And so things like storage, right? Like this is the thing that I think is terrible in Kubernetes land also, is developers having how to deal with storage. So in ODO, it's just, or ODO storage, create some storage on the node storage, right? I just want storage. I don't want to talk to you about PVCs. I don't want to talk to you about what labels and all that other stuff. Just give me some disk. And I want disk to have like this kind of behavior. That's it. And where to mount it. Right?
That sort of sounds good, but like, so you have to remember that Kubernetes is designed to kind of be versatile and try to provide the most value for many users, right?
Yep.
And if all you want to do is run a stateless serving workload, fine. That should be straightforward. And that experience maybe could be optimized quite a bit better from where it is today. But when you start talking about an unstructured spreadsheet,
you're breaking up. Is that me or is that it for everybody else too?
I hear it too.
Okay.
So when you start talking about more complicated workloads, like things that use structured storage or unstructured storage, network intensive workloads, batch scheduling, or any of those things, it gets a little bit muckier, right? Which is one of the reasons
but it's again, right now, the experience is start from there. Start as if you have to understand all the pieces to run something with network going storage. The idea with something like ODO is I don't need that. No one's building that app out of the box. They need to, and once I've decided, oh, Kubernetes, nice stuff is nice on Kubernetes, I can go learn that other stuff. If I need to go do that intensive stuff, I can go learn it. But I don't have to start there, which is what we say now. Jump in the deep end of the pool and start learning to swim. That's it.
Sort of,
yeah,
but like you can do a deployment with a service and an ingress, right? And if you do nothing else, and like if you set reasonable resource limits, you can get something up and running. Right?
So
like,
you have to create a deployment. You have to create a service. And you got to have an ingress. You also have to have an ingress control like Nginx ingress installed in your cluster, right? Right. And so you've got to know the right annotations to put on your ingress so that Nginx ingress can pick it up. And so you've already had to create all these things and know this context in order to launch your simple service, right?
You have to learn a pod. You have to learn a pod descriptor. You have to learn a template. You have to learn, you want me to go through what all the different things we make people have to, there's no description in our YAML files about what's actually required, what's not required. So you actually have to go through and learn a YAML format and all the things in there and what those words mean and how to fill them in appropriately with no type support. Like it's no problem with putting in a typo or anything else. The barrier to actually just doing your simple app, that just spinning up Apache, serving static content is immense for the average developer.
I guess all I can say is that having worked on Mesos, Kubernetes, having worked with Borg, and a little bit with Aurora guys and Docker Swarm, I gotta say that like, yes, it's still difficult, but Kubernetes is better than its predecessors. And I mean, like we can continue to improve, but it's never like been easy. Like
Docker Compose was actually pretty damn easy, and Kubernetes benefited from the size of its community and the fact that Docker was jerks to everybody else and killed their community. But if Docker actually built good software and it had worked as good as Kubernetes worked out of the box, we would have lost.
Docker Compose is the same thing as Docker Swarm would be more comparable to Kubernetes in certain ways.
But you could use a compose file to import it into Swarm, and then that would just do the right thing. So for a developer, they just had to start with compose to get Apache running, right? And the concepts in Compose were really freaking simple. I want this pod, I want this Docker container, I want this Docker container, I want them to talk to each other, and I want you to give me a URL. And that's all you had to say. And there was no, it was maybe, I don't remember if it was YAML or not. I never used Docker Compose, but I saw the files and they were small and it was.
Start trying to get to running more complicated workloads like Spark.
But you keep going to more complicated workloads, but you haven't solved the simple one. Like
So think about it this way. Just think about it a different way. With a lot of the other systems out there, people can have fun in 5 minutes. I can go launch very simply my simple service. And then as I need to deal with more complicated, I learn more complicated. We expect that you start with the most complicated possible situation, and you have to learn all of that even to do the simple, which means you don't get to start with the simple. You have to start with the most complicated. In order to deploy my stateless microservice, I have to go learn enough where I could also deploy the most complicated thing that I'm ever going to deploy, right? I have to learn all of that even to do the simple. And that's where we run into a problem. And I'm reminded here, Stripe and their cron setup. Did everybody see what they did a couple of years ago? They came up with a super simplified cron format so the developers never had to do it. They just learned run this script in this place and do it this often using a normal cron tab format. And their system would turn it into cron jobs and do all of the transformation. So they didn't have to learn any of that. And it created this really simple format that they had to learn. They didn't have to know the rest.
Interested the same thing. My point is that, like, yes, I see a lot of organizations building their own platform on top of Kubernetes and using Kubernetes as an infrastructure orchestrator in order to make the lives of developers easier. We do the same thing at Breps, right? Like, it's not, I mean, like, is the level of effort small? No, but you don't need to say you need 1,000 engineer team to do it is also a little bit hyperbolic.
But right now, most of this stuff is in-house proprietary. It's not out-house, out in the open source, which means most people can't pick it up because there aren't enough people who can go develop those tools who understand so that every company can have their own bespoke processes. So you end up with most people just suffering through it because you don't have the tools to put on top.
I think, and the point of saying you even have to have an engineering team to build the tooling on top is a broken assumption. Like, if that's what it takes, then most companies aren't going to adopt. Like, oh, well, to really get it to work decent for your people inside, you actually need to go hire an engineering team of 5 people. And they can do it. If you find 3 people or 5 people who know Kubernetes pretty well and also have experience in building developer tooling, you can probably build something at your company. Most companies will be like, I don't even want, and especially developers who are like, I have some time on the weekend. I want to check out this Kubernetes thing. Is it worth it or not? I'm going to download it and see how I get to going.
I'm sympathetic to the pain of people who are coming onto Kubernetes for the first time, for sure. But you keep coming back to this argument that we need to increase adoption or that adoption is troubled. Like, do we really, do we have data to support that Kubernetes adoption is troubled? That we're being
at the application developer level? Yeah. Every time I go out to a customer site and I talk to them about OpenShift and they're like, yeah, we're not introducing that to developers yet because there's no way they're going to understand it and they're not going to be able to use it. Every single customer I go to, the ops team likes it. No application. They're like, we'll just have them develop stuff in containers and we'll figure out how to do it for them.
So let me say this. Anecdotally, by people who go to customers, there's piles of information out there. Statistics-wise, I read one analysis, and I can't remember who did it, so I can't track it down, that talked about things like container taking on versus Kubernetes, and they actually did a bunch of the measurement on it, but I can't remember who did it. So I know a lot of anecdotal information, and we've got that where I'm at, piles of it. And I've heard everybody else, I hear piles of this all the time. But then the actual statistics, I've read it once, and they were out there, but I can't remember who had them, so I can't find them again.
I also think it's like vitamins, where no one's going to pay for the clinical trials on vitamins because there's not enough money in it. No one's actually going to pay for the survey to actually go find out the actual data. And then usually what ends up happening is saying, well, there's no actual data, so this isn't actually really a problem.
I mean,
but that's not true.
Datadog releases statistics on utilization of container infrastructure on a yearly basis.
Yes, that is not the Datadog does because they talk about just how containers are used. They don't actually talk about application developer experience. And that's one company who's nice enough to share it.
If we're talking about adoption, I'm talking about market saturation. Like, out of people using containers, are people using other things in Kubernetes because it's so painful? which is a different thing to me than should we work to try to make the application developers' life easier, which I think we should. But
So how here becomes one of the problems though, because what's going on with this, but we're also trying to get into a lot of new markets, such as the enterprise. The enterprise is now adopting containers and cloud at a much stronger rate, right? And you've got, there are teams building applications that have 3, 4, 5, 6 or more hundred developers working on an app. And now you've got to onboard them to doing things with Kubernetes. That is a gigantic cost sink for them to go learn all of this Kubernetes, which then becomes cost prohibitive. And so they say, well, we're going to go to a different setup that is more conducive to onboarding our stuff than to going with Kubernetes. And this is happening because they're looking for things that have a much smaller barrier to entry, where they don't have to spend so much time onboarding so many people to Kubernetes.
Like what?
Yeah. What do they use instead?
Yeah. Like Pivotal, Cisco, VMware, Amazon, Microsoft, everybody, most people have gone in on adopting Kubernetes as kind of the de facto orchestrator for containers. This is even for on-prem services as far as I've seen. I mean, people do use other things. Like, I mean, Rancher is still a thing. And like, we can make the developer experience better, but to say that like.
No, but that's like, I agree with you. So I'm saying Kubernetes has won. Kubernetes will be the container operating system of the future. That is without a doubt. I don't think there's any discussion about that anymore. I think the question is whether we can actually get for me, it's not about adoption at the company level, it's adoption at the developer level. And whether if you just want to build a SysOp or if this is just a SysOp, a DevOps or some systems administrator tool, that's fine. But I actually think that does a huge disservice and misses out on a lot of the power that Kubernetes could bring to others.
Think about this. Right now, the sysadmins and DevOps people tend to like Kubernetes. And they are now dragging the app developers, on, kicking and screaming because they don't like it. Do we want to keep that as the status quo? Or do we want to make it so they're delighted by it as well, and they're not being ripped along, kicking and screaming, annoyed that their organizations are trying to force them to use it? How do we want the situation to be?
I mean, obviously, I'd like it to be a wonderful experience for developers. And like inside of my company, I work very hard to try to, build the right primitives and abstractions on top of Kubernetes to make that happen. In order to develop something that's more useful to the community and build an abstraction on top of it though, like I think it's a great idea. It's just, it's a very high level of effort. So I mean, you need to get people invested in contributing to something, and it would probably be outside the scope of Kubernetes proper, right? Like if you want SIG Apps to host a project, that I could be all behind that, but it's a matter of like actually getting developers to spin something up and build something and then test it. And then before it's actually like prime time, if you're going to do something in general, it takes years to get through early adoption and into mainstream. It's a long time. So,
but we can encourage it. We can help that growth. Leading doesn't mean owning and controlling. Leading means enabling and encouraging, building up others to do this. It's the ecosystem around Kubernetes that needs this. So how do we encourage and enable and get them excited? Because so often they're told not to. In fact, there's been public statements. There have been long discussions on Twitter and in other venues where people say, no, every developer should learn all the complexities of Kubernetes. And they're being told not to do this. And people right now are being discouraged from doing this. And there have been debates about discouraging that. And so how do we encourage people to do this?
And so I'm expecting our timeline to be something like the storage SIG. Storage in the beginning was absolutely miserable. There was very few plugins, but the storage SIG just kind of actually started talking about it, making standards around it, putting some code in to get things to work properly. And I would imagine that would be kind of what we would do around app development, right? Like, and over time, people will build more and more plugins and build more and more things and actually come and contribute more. And the timeline is long. Yeah, of course it is.
So can I make 2 suggestions now? I want to do a time check because we're 6 minutes over. And I want to be respectful because people are dropping off. They've got to go to other meetings. So the only thing I would ask is if we could wrap up this discussion and move it into future discussions, the next of which would be 4 weeks out because we're every other week and we're not meeting in 2 weeks?
Works for me.
And thank you, Steve, for bringing this up and going into such depth. I appreciate it.
All right, and I hope I'm not upsetting anybody. I mean, this is just, as Misesh will be able to testify, this is just generally how I think out loud. And
I don't think you're upsetting anybody. I mean, like, it's nice to hear complaints, but like, and hear feedback. And we all know it's a rough experience. I think the challenge is like, if you really want to do something about it, like evangelizing is one thing, but contributing code, like actually building something is what would solve it.
Yeah, but this isn't a thing that's a code contribution thing. I think it's actually more of a kind of there's a lot of thought that has to go in before starting with the code. And I would hope it wouldn't just be the things that were inside my head, right? So like I tried that at Red Hat with that ODO thing where I put together a spec and then we started working. And then for various reasons, I mean, it's happened, but it's happened to varying degrees. I don't understand. I'm not a Go developer, and nor do I think I should become a Go developer. That is not where I make and I don't think I should actually be a core person on Kubernetes, but I do think I have interesting feedback to give and I can help write specifications and talk about things such as that helps people decide what to build and what's important.
So one small comment I have is like, I'm as part of SIG architecture, I'm leading a group which is doing tech debt research for Kubernetes. And we are basically looking at issues, PRs, or discussions which basically can help reduce tech debt in core Kubernetes. So if you think there are things related to usability that would basically require features or anything that we can do in the core Kubernetes that will make your discussion easier or usability of apps easier, I think that would be another area where you can dig out issues and bring them to the project board. I'll link the project board in the SIG Apps channel.
For sure. And like, if there's things that we can do for the workloads API to make them more consumable, that's always feedback we'd like to have too. But Matt, like you said, time check. We're like 8 minutes over, so I think we should wrap it up for today. We're going to miss the next meeting because of KubeCon, so we'll see you in 4 weeks' time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for such a great discussion today.
Thanks.
Thanks,
everyone.
bye.